Welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution, the podcast for secular progressive homeschoolers who are reimagining education for their kids unapologetically. I am your host, Ashley, and today we are celebrating Pride Month, and we're having conversations about a specific topic that I think is extremely important, especially as a homeschooling parent, a parent who's raising kids as allies, a community builder, and someone who believes that education should tell the truth. We have to understand our today's topic. There is no liberation without all of us, Black, brown, and queer. And so I don't want you guys to be performative. I don't want to be a performative ally. I want y'all to understand that pride is more than rainbow flags. It's more than parades. It's more than the love is love. It is political, it is historical, and it is resistance. And when we talk about queer liberation, we cannot separate it from racial justice, disability justice, immigration justice, and gender justice. Because our kids deserve to understand that people do not live single issue lives, and we're going to talk about what intersectionality is. And Black queer people exist, brown queer people exist, disabled people who are queer exist, immigrant queer people exist, trans kids exist, queer families exist, queer elders exist. This is not something new. Queer has always been around. Queer people have always been here. And it's, because I say that in response to people saying, now everybody's gay. Back when I was growing up, there was hardly any gay people. No, they were there. They were just surviving and not exposing themselves because it was safer for them not to. But they were there. Queer people get rejected by their families. Queer kids get kicked out of their homes. Queer people who are building beautiful families and communities to exist need strong allyship, and we can't be performative by just standing there at the corner with our flags. And we also, this is a year I think I'm focusing on, it's not just about being kind. We can't just sit here and kill everything with kindness. We need action behind it. And if anything, Pride was started with a riot. The first people to throw punches because they had enough were Black and brown trans women. This was a movement, and there is no liberation without all of us, and we need to talk about it. So let's get into it. What intersectionality actually means. So before we go deep into the conversation, I want to make sure we are all working from the same foundation, because intersectionality is a word that gets tossed around a lot, and I feel like it gets stripped of its meaning, and I want to be more responsible than that. Before we go anywhere and start peeling back the onion layers, I want to make sure we're all working from the same foundation, because intersectionality is a word that gets tossed around and watered down, and it gets stripped. And I think it's because people are so irresponsibly tossing it around. So the term itself was coined by the activist Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and she was writing about Black women experiences in the workplace. And she was making the argument that race and gender could not be separated, and that the specific discrimination Black women faced wasn't just about being Black, and it wasn't just about being a woman, but it was added together. And it is its own thing. And, it's a specific experience that happens from holding both identities at once. And she was right, because that framework extends far beyond workplaces and just Black women. It extends to every system of power that we move through. And intersectionality says we are not just one thing. We are the sum of everything we carry: our race, our gender, our sexuality, our class, our ability, our immigration status, our language, and our religion or lack of it. And the systems we move through respond to all of those things simultaneously. And for some reason, we get stuck that those things are held separately, and they absolutely aren't. And the work by Dr. Crenshaw proves it. And so when we're talking about queer liberation specifically, and when we're talking about what pride actually means, we cannot carve out only the parts that feel comfortable or pretty or, digestible, and we don't want to address the complicated parts. That means we are creating a movement that only centers white, cisgendered, able-bodied, mostly middle-class, gay and lesbian people, and that's not liberation work. It is really us assimilating because we like a neutral stance. That's assimilating, and we don't want to give it better optics. And I really love that, like Audre Lorde, she was a Black lesbian feminist poet who was telling us decades ago that freedom is not divisible. Like, you cannot cut liberation into pieces and hand out the comfortable slices while leaving the rest on the table. And I want to dive into some examples of what intersectionality can look like. So again, that we're all starting on the same foundational piece. So again, let's go back to being a Black woman who is queer. She cannot experience the world only as being Black on Monday and only as queer on Tuesday and only as a woman on Wednesday, because all of those identities are present at the same time, all of the time. Okay. Another example is a disabled trans kid. So when you're a disabled trans kid in itself, right, they're not just going to be able to just navigate the disability support, right? They're also having to navigate their gender identity and access to safe bathrooms, medical bias, family acceptance, and ableism. And then a third example is an undocumented queer teen. They aren't just worried about being accepted by the community. There's layers to it, because they may be worried about their own safety, their immigration enforcement, especially in this day and age, family separation, language access, and whether they can trust the systems around them. And when we understand this part of intersectionality, it's going to help us as allies who are not in the queer community, ask better questions and go deeper than, are queer people included? But it's going to ask us and challenge us to say, well, are Black queer people included in your story? Are Latin queer people included? Are disabled queer people included? Are trans kids protected? Are immigrants' families safe? Are queer books by authors of color on your shelves? Are you exposing your kids to that? And I feel like, we also have to ask ourselves, are we teaching pride in a way that honors the people who actually fought for it? Because, again, it was started with a riot. It was started by, Black and brown women, and we need to honor them by giving a pride to our kids. That is not whitewashed. That is not sanitized. That is not comfortable. And that is not a well-rounded picture, because offering them something incomplete is a huge disservice to them, to us in our status as allies, and we have to do better. So hopefully we fully understand the term intersectionality, and that these layers are always there all the time and cannot be taken off or chosen when we feel like it. Let's talk about queerness and racial justice. First, we have to mention what actually happened at Stonewall, because I feel like there is a version of this story that is mainstreamed and sanitized, and it's giving very much after school special. And, it basically sums up saying gay people got tired of being harassed and they fought back. And while that is true, but that's not complete. Just to give a quick summary, Stonewall Inn in 1969 was not a place for, wealthy white gay men in button-down shirts who were corporate workers. It was a space for marginalized people in the queer community, the drag queens, the trans women, the, gender non-conforming people, queer youth. It was for the queer youth who had been thrown out of their homes, and Black and brown queer people just had didn't have a lot of options and a lot of places to go. The mafia did own the bar, the Stonewall Inn. The mafia owned the location, and the police raided it pretty frequently as a form of just overall harassment. And so it was already like red flags, right? It was a hangout for Black and brown people. It was a hangout for gay Black and brown people, and the mafia owned it. So it was like a lot of things that could set off the harassment. And on June 28th, 1969, the people were like, no more, F that, I'm sick of this. And Marsha P. Johnson, who was a Black transgender woman, was a sex worker, was a survivor. And that's another conversation we need to dig into about sex work and honoring it, but was a survivor and in all intents and purposes was a revolutionary. And that night, she had been described by those who were present as one of the first people to resist. That's why we know her name associated with Stonewall. She spent her life after Stonewall fighting for homeless queer youth and people with AIDS and constantly trying to rewrite the narrative around AIDS and that it was only something that gay people could get. Very much an activist. And then you had Sylvia Rivera, who was a Venezuelan Puerto Rican transgender woman who was also there and was the co-founder of STAR, which was a street transvestite action revolutionaries community space. With Marsha, they co-founded it together, and they spent decades fighting for trans rights, for incarcerated queer people, for people who the mainstream gay movement kept pushing out. And she was famous for saying, I'm tired of being at the back of the bus. And these women were the architects of the movement that gave us pride. And for decades, I would really say up until like the early 2000s, there was hardly any mention of them. And that is part of erasing history. That erasure was not an accident. And that's what happens when a movement decides that some of its founders are inconvenient and uncomfortable. They were too Black, too trans, too poor, too radical. And that doesn't match the rainbow, picture perfect, flowery ideologies that people like to sit with when it comes to pride. So when we teach pride to our kids, we need to teach the full history. We need to teach who actually was there. We need to teach why the rainbow flag means something different to Black trans teenagers in 2025 than it does to white cisgender gay man with a mortgage. And that's not being divisive. That's true. And in the words of Marsha P. Washington, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. Now I want to bring in another layer that gets left out of pride conversations, which is disability justice, because queer liberation and disability justice have never been separate. And one of the clearest places we've seen that was during the AIDS crisis. So when HIV and AIDS were devastating the queer communities in the 80s and the 90s, the government was non-responsive. And society treated people with AIDS as if they were disposable and they were not worth fighting for. And then there was like shame and isolation and was happening, and people with AIDS were denied care, and they were dying left and right without dignity. And of course, since the government was doing what the government does, which is nothing, community stepped in. And queer people organized care networks. They raised money. They brought in food. They sat at hospital beds. They fought pharmaceutical companies. They protested the government. They demanded research and treatment and access. And that is disability justice, because disability justice is not just saying, hey, here's a ramp And here's some accommodations. And yes, those things matter, but it's not enough. Disability justice does ask us who is being treated as disposable, right? It asks us to challenge that. And who is denied care? Who is expected to survive without support? Who gets access to medicine and safety and housing and community? And during the AIDS crisis, there was this dope-ass group called the ACT UP, and it stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and it showed us what it looks like when people refuse to be quiet and keep quiet and accept that death was the only option given to them. And they used action, they used force, they used protests, they disrupted money, they disrupted businesses, they challenged the FDA and the CDC and churches and politicians and the media. And they did that because people were dying and the people in power looked away. And we see that now, even with our own current healthcare system. But we're talking about this was happening in the 80s and the 90s. And we're in 2026 still dealing with that crap. But I'll go back to our disability justice conversation. But queer people were fighting for the right to live, to receive healthcare, to be offered some compassion. And they wanted to be treated as human, and they wanted their illness to be taken seriously. And they were being abandoned by family and church and government and medical systems. And that's why we connect directly to disability justice, because disabled people always have had to fight against the idea that some bodies are worthless and some lives are worthless and some people are just too expensive, too complicated, too sick, too dependent, and overall just too much. And disability justice says no. You are not a burden, you're not a problem to solve, and your life has value. And that's where I want to bring in Mia Mingus, who was a queer disabled woman of color and a disability justice organizer. Mia talked about access intimacy, which is that feeling when someone understands your access needs without making you feel like a burden. And it's when care is not treated as a charity. It's when access is built into the relationship and into the room and into the community. And that matters. And because so many marginalized people knew what it feels like to enter a space and immediately wonder, and we still ask that now, will I be safe here? Will I have to explain myself? Will I be accommodated? Will I be believed? Will people get annoyed by my needs? Will I have to shrink a part of myself to belong? Queer kids have to learn to ask those questions. Disabled kids have to ask those questions. Black and brown kids ask those questions. Neurodivergent kids ask those questions. Trans kids ask those questions. Immigrant kids ask those questions. And kids who live at the intersection of those identities have to ask even more. And I think that's why we have to loop this conversation in for us as progressive homeschoolers, who, again, are changing the way our kids look at education and history in a very unapologetic way. Because when we're building these homeschool spaces, co-ops, micro schools, trying to do field trip meetups, play dates, book clubs, and just any kind of community, we have to ask, are we only making this space for kids who already can fit in? Or are we building spaces where access, affirmation, and belonging are a part of the actual foundation? Now let's talk about immigration justice and why it belongs in the pride conversation. So queer liberation cannot be separated from immigration justice because queer and trans immigrants face multiple systems at once. They face racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, detention, poverty, and a lack of legal protection. And so for many LGBTQIA plus immigrants, the issue is not just acceptance, but it is safety. And some queer and trans people come to the U.S. seeking asylum because they are unsafe in their home countries due to their sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression. And they also are probably fleeing, family rejection and police violence, government violence, community violence. And there are laws that criminalize who they are. And when arriving in the US, for some reason they think, oh, come to the US, that means safety. But that's not what that automatically means. And for queer and trans migrants, think about it. They face danger through the migration process and then, also throughout the asylum process. And they, struggle to access legal help and gender affirming care and HIV medication and mental health support and just overall protection from harassment and abuse. And this is why detention is a queer issue. Immigration systems directly impact queer and trans people, especially those who are in the Black, brown, and undocumented, disabled, poor, or non-English speaking spaces. And I think this is a great time to bring up Gloria Anzaldúa. She is a queer Chicana feminist writer. She wrote Borderlands, La Frontera, and it really does help us understand that borders are more than just lines on a map. She writes about that the borderlands are a place of living in between. You're living in between languages and cultures and identities, belonging and rejection. And that is especially important when we're talking about queer Latinx lives. And queer Latinx person may live between English and Spanish, U.S. culture, family culture, cultural pride, cultural rejection, and then being racialized in America and being told queerness does not belong in their own community. That is intersectionality, because it's not just about being queer. It's not just about being Latinx. It's not just about being an immigrant. It is how those identities overlap and shape someone's safety, belonging, healthcare. And for homeschoolers, when we talk about the immigration process and its impacts on the queer and trans community, this gives us another layer, a deeper way to talk about pride. And instead of us just asking, like, how do we celebrate, pride, we can also say, who is the most vulnerable inside of the LGBTQIA plus community? Why might a queer person seek asylum? How does detention impact trans people? How does race, language, gender, sexuality, and immigration status overlap? I feel like this also helps us challenge the way immigration is often taught. A lot of people like to focus on or whenever I've come across it in books or texts or trying to build the conversation, I saw a lot of mentions of Ellis Island and citizenship and legal status. And when I'm wanting to approach the conversation for immigration and Pride Month, I want to approach it from a justice-centered way. So I do want to clearly identify who gets welcomed, who gets criminalized, whose movement is seen as an opportunity, and whose movement is treated as a threat, and in which way do our movements digestible for, dominant culture. And when we add a queer lens, what happens when someone leaves a home because being queer or trans puts them in danger? But what happens when the place they're trying to flee to also harms them? And I think it's important we ask these questions because it answers why immigration justice belongs in the pride conversation. And it brings us back to the idea that there's no liberation without all of us, and not just the queer people with citizenship, not just the queer people who are easy for society to accept, but all of us. So what does this all mean for your homeschool? I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to bring it home to what this actually means for your curriculum and your conversations and your community, because after all, this is a homeschool podcast. So one thing you need to do is teach history with everybody included. So if you're talking about the civil rights movement, you should be including Bayard Rustin. He was the gay Black man who organized the March on Washington, and he was erased from public narrative just because of his sexuality. And there's a really good movie out that was recently released in the last 5 years. And I mean, I felt like it was middle school appropriate. And it talks about his role in the civil rights movement. Go check it out. And then when you're teaching Stonewall, lead it with Marsha and Sylvia. And when you teach the AIDS crisis, teach them about the community work that the organization ACT UP did. And when you teach about the women's rights movement, well, just movements of rights of women, you have to include Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa and not just Susan B. Anthony, because liberation movements have always been led and shaped by people at multiple intersections, and that's how you should look and teach history. And always ask the intersectional questions. In any historical or contemporary lesson, build the habit of asking who's benefiting from this system, who is harmed by it, whose story is being told, who's being left out, where are those people, what contributions were they making to history at that time? These questions really help critical thinking and the practice of understanding intersectionality. Another thing you can do is build your library. Your library at home should include queer Black characters, queer brown characters, queer disabled characters, queer immigrant characters, and not just as tokens, right? We don't want the tokenism happening. We want them to actually be the protagonists in the story. Because if your LGBTQIA trans books are all about white kids in the suburbs, you have a lot of work to do. You need to expand yourself in your library. What could community engagement look like? Participate in Pride Month events, whether it's with your homeschooling community or sponsored by the city, and when you're at these events, ask who is centered. Are Black and brown queer families visible? Are trans families visible? Are disabled families present and accommodated? And, who is running the room? And when you see gaps, say something or build something, because that is, the culture we are creating for our kids, right? We don't want them to just be passive. We want them to understand what's happening. And also let your kids see that you're learning. I don't have everything figured out. You don't have everything figured out. And bring that to wherever you do school. I'm a forever learner, and there's a profound educational value in letting kids watch you learn and question things and grow. Say things out loud. Like, I didn't know about Marsha P. Johnson until a few years ago, and then tell them on the journey of how you discovered her and what information you learned, because you're modeling the critical thinking you want them to develop. So I do want to offer you guys some resources, and I will list them in the show notes. Some books that center BIPOC and queer stories. Intersection Allies, We Make Room for All by Chelsea Johnson. I think this is a gorgeous picture book, and it explicitly explains intersectionality, and it's age appropriate. It does say for ages 4 through 8. Next is a bilingual picture book, and it says When We Love Someone, We Sing to Them. And this is by Ernesto Ortíz. And it is about a Mexican family with a gay son, and they are showing in the pictures, they're so warm, and the story is so affirming. Another book is Neither by Arlie Anderson, and it is, again, a picture book about not fitting into categories. Another one I'd like, and I'll add some more in the show notes. I'm just trying to throw you guys some options. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This one is a young adult memoir, and it's about a Black queer author coming of age story. I think it was beautiful. My my teen read it and was like crying. And not in a like, it was I mean, there were some hard moments, but just like seeing them win throughout, the ups and downs. So I didn't read it, but I know this was one of her favorites. Some history nonfiction you can check out is Brave Black First by Cheryl Hudson. And this is 50 African-American firsts that include queer trailblazers. Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. It's her essays and speeches. And I think this one's more for parents and older teens. I think it would be really hard to do middle school and elementary with that book. Another one is Queer There and Everywhere by Sarah Prager. And this is a great book because it does include BIPOC queer figures across history. And I would place this one as like upper elementary and up. Some online resources, Teaching Tolerance, Learning for Justice, which is at learningforjustice.org. And they do have some great lesson plans that are free that teach identity, intersectionality, and justice. Another online website is Familia, Trans Queer Liberation Movement, and it's familiatqim.org. And again, this will be in my show notes. And then Disability Justice Club at disabilityjustice.org by Mia Mingus. And it's a great resource to understand disability justice and intersectionality. And a couple documentaries I think that would be good are The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. This one is on my Netflix. I don't know if it'll be on your Netflix. And then Disclosure, and this one's by Laverne Cox. I know Laverne Cox was doing some controversial comments a few months ago, but it is a good documentary. I might be able to find that one on we watched this one last year, the year before last, and I was able to watch it on Netflix. So if anything, it might be on YouTube. So I want to close today by saying something directly to you, the parents and the educators who are in this work. I want you to understand the work that we are doing is important. It is rooted in truth, in full humanity, and in the understanding that no one's story is not worth telling. This is not small work. It is not separate from the larger project of justice. This is just another piece of the puzzle. And every single time you put a book on your kid's shelf or their reading list where the protagonist is Black and brown or queer, and they are navigating the world with full humanity, you are doing something that public school systems in most of this country will not do. Every time you say the name Marsha P. Johnson, you are refusing her erasure. And every time you ask your kid who's left out of the story, you are teaching them to think like a liberator. And that is the revolution, not a single dramatic moment or, it's not dramatic because you are being intentional with the choices and conversations you are having with your kids. And queer liberation cannot be separated from racial justice, period. You cannot hold the rainbow flag and drop the fist. You cannot say love is love and ignore the Black trans woman who was murdered last week because, her name never made national news. There's no liberation without all of us. And I'm not saying this because I want it to be a slogan, but it is a framework and it is a commitment. And I hope it becomes the North Star for your education that you're building, that there is no liberation without all of us. And I'm so grateful to be doing this work with you. Happy Pride Month. Now go teach, a full picture of pride to your kids, and I hope you explore and learn new things on your journey. See you next episode. Thank you for listening to the Secular Homeschool Revolution. Also, if you enjoyed my work, please consider donating to Buy Me a Coffee, and also share this with your community members, someone who just needs a little bit of a push to dive deeper. I really appreciate you. See you next week.